Hello and welcome to Projector, and on this episode, the sky's the limit for Eddie Redmayne and Felicity Jones as the Aeronauts. In 1862, meteorologist James Glaisher, played by Eddie Redmayne, believes that weather can be studied and predicted against the skepticism of his fellow scientists. He convinces pilot Amelia Wren, played by Felicity Jones, to use her balloon to take him into the clouds so he can do research, while Amelia confronts her grief over the loss of her husband in a ballooning accident. Together, Glaisher and Wren take to the skies, pushing themselves to the limits of endurance as they journey to ever greater heights. The Aeronauts is based very, very loosely, and I'll get to that a bit later, on James Glaisher's balloon flight on the 5th September 1862, where he supposedly reached out to the heights of 36,000 feet before encountering difficulties. This is the second film this year directed by Tom Harper. I also reviewed the first, Wild Rose, which was a character-based drama about a woman from Scotland who was recently released from prison that aspired to be a country singer, that featured a fantastic performance by Jessie Buckley. This is the polar opposite of that movie in many ways. This is a much grander, spectacle-driven project. Harper is also best known for his television work, especially for helming episodes of Peaky Blinders. Many of the people that worked on that show also worked with him on this movie. Unfortunately for the Aeronauts, it's not getting the release it really deserves, because Amazon has changed their releasing strategy. They've had a lot of flops through releasing films theatrically, so now they're opting for more of a Netflix model. Internationally, where they weren't handling the distribution, this got quite a wide theatrical release, but in the US, it's going to be limited from December 6th, and then they're going to put it on their Prime Video service as quickly as possible on December 20th. And I think that's going to be worldwide. And that means that most of the people that are going to be watching the Aeronauts will be seeing it on their television screens, which is very unfortunate, because you realise as you're watching it, it was meant to be seen on the big screen. And in fact, the release strategy actually put questions over whether it would be released in IMAX at all. I think a couple of sites are showing it in that format, and that really is a shame. The Aeronauts is meant to be seen on the big screen. That's the environment it was truly made for. It's clear that the Aeronauts is meant to be an immersive experience that places you inside the basket alongside Wren and Glaisher as they make their journey up into the air, and if it feels like that, that's often because it is. It turns out, to film some of their scenes in this movie, they actually got the actors Felicity Jones and Eddie Redmayne to go up into the air in a balloon 8,000 feet in the sky, and they either had a cameraman in the basket or they were filming them with nearby helicopters. Obviously, a lot of this movie was also shot on green screens, but even so, that's an impressive amount of dedication, especially in terms of getting accurate performances from the actors. But that speaks to how phenomenal the production design here is. The period detail is impeccable, and once we go up into the sky, it just looks simply breathtaking. The shots of the balloon up in the sky are just jaw-dropping. They're so stunning, they could almost work as paintings, and this is especially true if you see the film in the IMAX presentation, because it's clear that was the version it was most designed for. So I actually sought out an IMAX screening of this movie, and even though the IMAX screen itself wasn't particularly that big, it's clear that the movie works far better in that format, because in the IMAX version, all the scenes where they're up in the sky in the balloon are opened up on the top and bottom of the screen. So that means that in the IMAX presentation, I'd estimate that around 60% of the movie has far more picture than its regular matted counterpart, and this leaves some substantial differences between them. For instance, the scenes in the basket, already a quite cramped, claustrophobic environment, I'd imagine in the regular version that feels very tightly framed as the camera is handheld, following the characters around in long continuous shots. In the IMAX version, those get a lot more room to breathe, and it feels like it's been composed with that framing in mind, especially as I'd imagine that characters sometimes fall out of frame as the camera struggles to keep up with them in the narrower aspect ratio. That's not a problem in the larger version. In those establishing shots that I mentioned, you get an even greater sense of scale, because opening up the top and bottom means the balloon looks even smaller in comparison to the rest of its surroundings. You get a greater sense of awe and wonder, but also of the isolation at the same time. And then, as the balloon gets ever higher, that's when the vertigo starts to kick in. If you have a fear of heights, this movie's going to be your worst nightmare, regardless of what version you see it in. But in the IMAX one, because you get a lot more picture information, that means that when the characters are dangling off the side of the balloon and you can see the ground below them, you can see a lot more of it, and you can very much process how far away from the ground they are, which just adds to the sense of jeopardy. So if you have a choice of which version of this movie to see, absolutely see it in the IMAX one. You can certainly tell they took a lot of inspiration from Gravity in that we focus on these two characters almost exclusively for the majority of the running time, a man and a woman, as they journey into open and dangerous spaces, and they have to use their wits and ingenuity to survive any obstacles. But this also applies to things like structure, in that the Aeronauts places the balloon adventure at the forefront, so we follow that in something approximating real time, with even captions on screen telling us how much time has elapsed, in much the same way that Gravity often takes place in real time. To further amplify that is the camera work. A lot of the scenes in this movie play out in relatively long takes, especially when the characters are moving from one particular set piece to the next. And that very much reminds you of Gravity, which famously stitched together several shots to make extended long takes that covered many minutes of that movie at a time. The Aeronauts doesn't try to pull that particular trick off, but even so, there are definitely moments where the camera follows the characters as they move across the screen in much the same way. And sometimes this can be used to very dizzying effect, particularly in one moment where Amelia is on top of the balloon and she starts to slide off, and the camera does so alongside her. So when she falls, the camera spins through the air and we have no idea where our trajectory is, and it's a very, very scary and effective moment. It shows how effective those techniques are, even if it's maybe a little bit derivative, but I will want to stress that The Aeronauts does feel like a different enough movie to Gravity, but there is definitely an obvious inspiration there. It's clear what The Aeronauts is trying to do is really capture a sense of wonder about the whole thing. It's meant to be celebrating the sense of adventure, about exploring new frontiers and expanding our knowledge. It's about how great science can be. Unfortunately, that structure is at the root of many of the film's problems, not least of which because it doesn't truly commit to it. I commend the way the film opens in media res. It opens right before they set out on their fateful balloon adventure, and that shows a good level of narrative economy. It streamlines it, gets rid of all the unnecessary guff leading up to it, and drops us right at the heart of the action. It grips us right from the outset. But alas, it feels compelled to fill in their backstories anyway, and it does this through extensive use of flashbacks peppered all throughout the narrative, and these don't work for a number of different reasons. The first is that they feel disruptive. If you've got a ticking clock structure like this movie has, and it's supposed to be playing out in real time, it really takes away from the tension you're supposed to be building up by cutting to events that have taken place years before what's going on. And so you've got these long flashbacks, and then suddenly we're thrown right back into the balloon, and it takes a moment to adjust to a certain extent. You have to remember the stakes, and that feels unfortunate. Gravity would be a much lesser movie if they kept deflating themselves by cutting away to Sandra Bullock's home life years before she went up into space. No one will want to see that, and that applies here. But even if we excuse that, there's still the matter of the fact that these scenes are dramatic non-starters, because most of the flashback sequences are characters wondering, will I ever go up in the air? Will I ever go in a balloon again? Will I ever get to do this research that I've been wanting to accomplish? accomplished when the audience already knows the answer is yes, because we've been watching that movie already. Why have you cut away from that to all this material that is totally irrelevant and often tension-free? When Amelia decides that she's got cold feet and pulls out for a time, what is we as an audience meant to feel about that when we ultimately know she goes up in the balloon with him? It just feels like empty padding to expand out a relatively thin story to feature length. But these additions don't bolt on anything that we can't have already grasped from the actions inside the balloon, and often these backstories feel very one-dimensional. They feel very stock and quite cliched. For example, Glacier is characterized as being an honest, noble, idealistic scientist whose peers think are radical in terms of his ideas, but is actually correct and knows that he has the possibility of saving lives. That is his primary concern. And I feel like I've seen variations of that in countless movies over the years, and this does nothing to distinguish itself. It doesn't help that the movie actually has quite a few recognisable faces in the supporting cast who only have a handful of scenes that again are just totally irrelevant to the proceedings. Tom Courtenay plays Glacier's father, who has dementia. That character could have easily been totally cut out of the movie. And yesterday's Himesh Patel gets the thankless pass of his best friend, who is just blandly supportive, admitting that while some people aim for the stars, others have to help them get there, and just stands around the ground the entire film. That's pretty much the entirety of his role, and even if you restructured the movie and put these scenes at the front of it in correct order, it still wouldn't work because these scenes are boring. You just would have spent the entirety of the movie waiting for them to get up into the balloon, to get to the point. You maybe could have had a couple of the most narratively important moments at the beginning of the film, but otherwise, all this stuff should have been jettisoned. It weighs the movie down constantly and takes away from the tension and the pacing. The only character that remotely benefits from this is Amelia, and that's largely because she's the more interesting character, to be honest. I know that Amelia Wren is a fairly controversial character in the film because actually she's an invented one. She's not the person that Glacier travelled up with. That would be Henry Coxwell. So this character is new to the film, has been entirely invented for it, although she does take inspiration from a number of female aeronauts from the period, notably Sophie Blanchard. But her character and the way that she's exploring her grief because her husband died in a ballooning accident, he sacrificed himself for her, and she's dealing with her own trauma, that at least is a little bit more interesting, if again, something I've seen in numerous other films with at least a little bit more personality than the way this film pulls it off. But in general, I think that Jones is the one that impresses the most. I think that the fact they got the 2 stars of the theory of everything back together was one of the main pulls of this movie. They obviously wanted to add a bit of prestige value here, and it just goes to show how good they are as performers. They hold your attention for virtually the entirety of the movie by themselves, even if there isn't that much in the way of characterization. Hell, they do a better job of sketching that out in terms of their performances than the movie does by dumping a load of backstory on top of them. And they do have a genuine chemistry between them. They work well together, even if the movie obviously doesn't try to force a romantic subplot between them, thankfully. But I do think it's Jones's movie, especially in the second half. She's the one who's more taking action, whereas Glacier, as he was in real life, was succumbing to the altitude and the freezing temperatures and suffering the effects of hypoxia, and as such, it falls onto Jones for much of the second half of the movie. But either way, both of these performances really are stellar. It's not their fault, even if the drama doesn't work. What hurts the movie, though, is its surprising lack of plausibility. Now, obviously, I know I'm not watching a documentary. I'm watching a fictionalised version of events that's taken a lot of creative liberties. That's why it's inspired by true events, not based on them. But even so, it's still inspired by something that did actually happen, so it should have a ring of truth about it. It should have some kind of authenticity there. And I did spend chunks of the Aeronauts going, I don't believe this. I don't believe that this happened. I don't believe that it would ever happen like this. And that's really a problem for a movie like this. And I first felt this in a fairly early sequence where they're rising through the clouds and they're going through a storm cloud, so they get pelted around with rain, and then suddenly gusts of wind are throwing around the balloon willy-nilly, and they're holding on for dear life, and the way that balloon's flinging itself around in CGI physics, you go, why aren't they just completely chucked out of the balloon at that moment? It just doesn't feel like something that they'd be able to survive. It feels so amped up. It feels like you're at an amusement park ride rather than something that's supposed to be telling a story of something that actually happened. And this keeps happening through the Aeronauts. They keep having to goose up what actually happened, because otherwise it's simply a movie about them going up in a balloon and then realising they've gone too far up and they're a bit stuck. But the movie keeps having to add all this spectacle on top of itself. And I understand that they need to make the story cinematic and interesting, but there's a way of doing that without making it feel fake like it does a lot of the time. The one sequence that I thought the movie really did start getting a little bit carried away with itself is when Amelia starts climbing up the balloon because a crucial valve won't open. Now, this is inspired by something that did actually happen. What happened was they reached up into the air and they realised that the valve on the balloon had frozen up. And in reality, what Coxwell did is that he climbed up onto the rigging, and fighting the fact that he felt that he was about to pass out, he gripped the rope tied to it with his teeth, pulled it, and managed to get the valve open. The movie takes that event and then amplifies it by about 10 by having her go up the side of the balloon at 35,000 feet. The top of it has totally iced over. As she climbs up, you're surprised she's not ripping the skin off her hand with every rung because of the freezing temperatures. She's not suitably dressed for it. Likewise, Glacier hasn't even brought his coats properly because he's so excited, which just makes him look like an idiot. And then, once she does get on top of it, yeah, she's getting frostbitten and burnt, and also she's succumbing to the altitude. But even when she does pass out, she doesn't freeze to death from lying on top of it like that. It just feels totally preposterous. Even Tom Cruise's Ethan Hunt would look at this and go, that's impossible, I'm not doing that. It feels like the filmmakers had an inch and then decided to expand it out to a yard. Yes, it's exciting, but it doesn't feel real. Don't claim it's a true story if you're going to take that much license with it. The Aeronauts is a mixed recommendation for me. On the one hand, it has gorgeous visuals, spectacular production design, two solid performances in the leads, and it really is exciting and thrilling in spots, even if it does strain credibility, especially with regard to the historical events that it purportedly brings to the screen. If you're truly interested in those, you're probably better off reading a book or an article about it rather than watching this. However, it also suffers from a weak, one-dimensional script, and often it does feel like they've concentrated more on the spectacle than anything else. So with that in mind, if you're interested in watching this movie, see it on the biggest screen you can possibly find. If you want to see this film, you'll have to go out and see it in a cinema, especially if you have access to an IMAX or a large format version. This needs to be seen in that environment. You'll get the most out of it, and also the story's shortcomings will be mitigated by those positives. If you're just simply watching it on Prime Video, unless you've got a massive television screen, you won't feel the full effects of this, unfortunately, and the shortcomings will be crushingly apparent. So if you're just simply watching this for Prime Video, you can just fly past it, unfortunately. See this the way it was meant to be seen. The Aeronauts functions as pure dazzling spectacle, and it's a shame that most viewers will likely end up seeing it on the small screen despite obviously being intended for IMAX, with sensational effects and visuals that transports the audience into the clouds along with the characters. Unfortunately, once you look past that, there isn't all that much here in terms of story or characterization, and while the reteaming of Redmayne and Jones gives enough life to the leads to engross you, the flashbacks to flesh them out are so thin they might as well have been removed entirely. There's also the fact that despite being inspired by true events, this fictionalized take simply doesn't feel all that credible, going for big survivalist set pieces that strain plausibility. The Aeronauts is ultimately diverting as a big screen rollercoaster ride, but will drift from your mind shortly after. If you like this review, then take flight over to my Patreon, where you can see my reviews early among other perks, including access to my Discord server. But until next time, I'm Matthew Buck, fading out.